Honor unveiled its new X30 series smartphones a couple months ago with the X30i and X30 Max, but left out the vanilla version in the new lineup, which Honor held an event for a few days ago, and its name, you guessed it, the Honor X30. The Honor X30 is the very first smartphone to go on sale with Qualcomm's new mid-range chipset, the Snapdragon 695 5G, and is one of the cheapest smartphones on the planet that utilizes 66-watt fast wired charging. Prices at the top left corner of the screen. This is indeed the Chinese variant of the device, which will hit shelves on December 24th in mainland China and will likely see a global launch in 2022. The Honor X30 comes in titanium silver, midnight black, gold, or the color that I have, which is called ocean blue. It is a glossy back finish and it looks pretty fantastic if you ask me. It looks very similar to designs that we've seen from Huawei in the past, that being the Mate 40 series and Honor's recently released Honor Magic 3 series devices, thanks to that circular camera module on the back. Inside the phone, we have a 4800 mAh battery, Snapdragon 695 chipset, LPDDR4 XRAM, UFS 2.1 storage, 5G, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth 5.1. Unfortunately, no NFC, but we do have a Gorilla Glass front, unfortunately a plastic back and plastic frames, but that is to keep it light at just 189 grams in weight and 8.05 millimeters in thickness. Within that circular camera module sits a main 48 megapixel snapper with an aperture of f1.8, a 2 megapixel depth sensor and a 2 megapixel macro sensor. Unfortunately, there is no ultra wide this time round, but then again, Honor X series don't usually include ultra wide cameras in their setups since their phones are just so darn cheap. That 48 megapixel main sensor can be binned down to 12 megapixels and it looks fantastic, honestly, in all different lighting conditions. Obviously, it looks the best in great natural lighting conditions outdoors. Here is the 48 megapixel main sensor. Binning it down looks a tad better thanks to AI, and we can zoom digitally, starting with 2 times over here, going to 5 times, which doesn't look the best, and the max zoom is 8 times, which really doesn't look the best, but the option is there if you'd like to use it. We do have that depth sensor and it makes for some awesome looking portrait shots, as well as the macro cam, which looks okay. I've seen better, but it's still there and it does a fairly decent job. We have 1080p at 30 FPS recording. This is the max resolution and frames per second we can record at. No 4K, no 60 FPS, unfortunately. Of course, no ultra wide as well, since there's no ultra wide lens on the back of the phone, but it does do a pretty decent job of blurring things in the background when I just showed you my little figurine over there. And 1080p 30 FPS video does seem pretty stable and it seems to do a decent job, but it does get a lot of interference with natural daylight sun hitting into the camera lens. 1080p 30 FPS at night, once again max res and max FPS. It doesn't look the best, it doesn't look the worst that I have actually seen when it comes to nighttime videography, but it's not perfect. 12 megapixel shot taken at night with night mode off. Night mode on actually does a pretty decent job for a mid-ranger such as this. Night mode off 2 times, digital zoom, night mode on, brighten things up a lot, but it lacks a bit of detail when night mode is switched on. Same thing can be said with 5 times, starts to make it look a bit grainy, and 8 times, which is the max zoom, doesn't look the best with night mode off and looks a slight bit blurrier with night mode on. Of course, you have to keep your hand super steady and I struggle a bit with that. Portrait at night looks pretty decent. You can put night mode on as well, but once again, a tad blurry, and there is no night mode option for the macro sensor, but it does an okay job at night. Nevertheless, I guess you could say the camera system is a bit of a mixed bag, but we'll have to forgive it since it is such a darn cheap phone. We have a power button on the right hand side, which is actually a physical fingerprint sensor as well. A volume rocker next to that, a dual SIM 5G standby SIM tray. At the bottom, unfortunately, no SD card expandable storage option there. USB 2.0 Type-C port, a single downward firing speaker since the top one is not for audio, but it is an earpiece for taking calls, and it is actually in the frame and not the display, which is crazy. The selfie camera is 16 megapixels over here, and it does a decent job for what it is. I mean, 16 megapixels on a budget phone, you're not going to expect class-leading results, but it actually does a better job than many flagships I've seen around when it comes to edge detection.
Yo, what's up guys, Technic here, recording a 1080p at 30 FPS selfie video on the brand new Honor X30. Let me know what you guys think of the audio as well as the video quality when recording using the selfie cam on the Honor X30.
Selfie video at night is of course also capped at 1080p and 30 FPS. Doesn't look too bad, there's some granules over here, but turning on the flash, which actually uses the white border around the screen, gives it a nice natural lighting effect when recording selfie video at night. So doesn't look half bad. There's no night mode video, unfortunately. Night mode off using the Selfie. Night mode on actually makes a drastic improvement, which is fantastic. Flash on actually looks worse than night mode on when using the Selfie. There is no night mode option for the bokeh effect. You can turn the flash on, but both of them don't look the best. The Selfie camera is more than decent for a phone at this price point. Once again, can't emphasize how well priced this device is. And turning on the phone, the first thing that you'll notice is that there is no always on display, but using that side mounted fingerprint sensor is nice and snappy, and it's easy to find since it's actually in the center of the phone and not so high up as I've seen with many other phones. We have 2D face unlock over here. It uses the Selfie camera, of course. It is not very secure, but it is nice and snappy and works as it should. We do have a 6.81 inch IPS LCD 20:9 aspect ratio flat dot display over here. It is full HD plus with a pixels per inch of 385. It has 16.7 million colors, a max brightness that I've personally tested at 540 nits, 120 Hz refresh rate, and 240 Hz touch sampling rate. The colors on the display really do pop, even though it is just a full HD plus panel. I mean, you're not going to expect QHD plus at this price point, and the whites are pretty white for an LCD display, and it supposedly has a 94% screen to body ratio because of those tiny bezels at the top and sides, which is really fantastic. Unfortunately, the chin is quite big, but of course, we do have 120 Hz refresh rate, and when comparing it to the 60 Hz option, we don't have a 90 Hz option in the middle. You can choose between 60 and 120. You can see how much more fluid 120 Hz is here, and if you're someone on a budget and you want to test out how fluid 120 Hz display is on a smartphone, then look no further than the Honor X30. There is a dynamic option when it comes to refresh rate, though it only switches between 60 and 120. And there's a smart resolution option. For some strange reason, maybe it can default down to 720p. We have a couple other display options over here, including a color mode in order to change the temperature and all that jazz, as well as a dark mode. But I mean, it's pretty strange since this is an LCD panel. I guess dark mode is on every phone these days. It does work with third-party apps as well, but using dark mode on an LCD panel isn't as power efficient when compared to using it on an OLED display. Magic UI 5.0 is the skin that we have skinned over Android 11 over here when it comes to the software department, which is very identical to Huawei's old EMUI software, since obviously it's been re-released as Harmony OS. They no longer use EMUI, but Honor is still using very similar software to EMUI. Unfortunately, no Google services over here, but this should be alleviated with the global launch, which should happen during 2022. We should get Android 12 and we should get full Google support, since Honor can now use Google services once more. We have a couple nifty options within the software fronts, and as you guys can see, I can open up YouTube on the Chinese variant of the phone, but I can't sign into an account. We can use split screen, and of course we can use the haptics, which are decent. They are not the best around, but they are on par with other phones at this price point. Unfortunately, there are no sound software features such as Dolby Atmos, but let's go ahead and give a listen to this single downfiring speaker. When it comes to gaming, Honor do include something called Game Space, which is an overlay that lets you do a couple tasks without leaving the game you're currently in, which is nice and nifty. Of course, we're using an FPS counter. For more on that, check the description down below. Starting with Genshin Impact here on the highest graphics. Remember, the game is capped at 60 FPS, so even if the Honor can do 120, it will always be capped at 60, and the Honor is getting just under 32 FPS on the highest possible graphics setting. Dropping that down to medium graphics instead of high, we're getting between 33 and 41 FPS, and then dropping it down to the lowest graphics setting, we're getting up to 52 frames per second, which is more than decent for a mid-range phone. And of course, Qualcomm's latest Snapdragon 695 chipset. Color me a tad impressed. Moving on to our next game here, which is of course Bullet Force using ultra graphics and max FPS. We're getting a stable frame rate of 60 FPS, but you've got to remember that this game can go up to An unlimited frame rate, meaning that this phone is capped at 120Hz, so it should be able to see 120 FPS. Unfortunately, we're not seeing that over here. We're not seeing it with Real Racing 3 either, though both games are sitting at a neat and stable 60 FPS. Unfortunately, no 120 FPS option for those games. As of yet, that could change. Now, when it comes to this new Snapdragon 695 chipset, it is, of course, running on 6nm process node architecture, and it is an octa-core processor with 2 main cores clocked at 2.21 GHz and 6 secondary cores clocked at 1.8 GHz, giving it 15% faster CPU processing and 30% faster graphics rendering using the integrated GPU, the Adreno 619, when compared to its predecessor, the Snapdragon 690. And hopping into some benchmarks over here, of course, we're going to be kickstarting things off with putting performance mode on, which is an option within the phone's battery settings, and checking out the battery percentage as well as the heat temperature at the start. We'll see how much it gains throughout these 3 benchmarks, starting with AnTuTu version 9.2.5, then moving on to Geekbench version 5.4.3 to test out just CPU in single and multi-core scores, and then ending off with 3D Mark Wildlife 2.2 to test out graphics only. Testing out the battery at the end and comparing it to the start of the test, it drained by 5%, with a milliamp hour per minute drain of just 14.12, and my channel average battery drain with this exact test that I just showed now is usually 22.5, which means this phone is ridiculously efficient. The temperature only gained by 4.2 degrees in Celsius, and to give you a comparison, the average temp gain on my channel in the same test is 13.4 degrees in Celsius, so this phone is certainly efficient when it comes to battery and very cool when it comes to temps. And when it comes to the AnTuTu version 9 score, we got a score of 396,910, which is not the best, but it's not the worst. It beat the Snapdragon 765G and Snapdragon 690, which is of course its predecessor, by quite a bit, but it was just shy of the MediaTek Dimensity 900 and 920 that we've seen on previous Honor devices. And focusing just on CPU over here, which is Geekbench version 5, we got a single core score of 674 and a multi-core score of 1870, which is a lot better than its predecessor, the Snapdragon 690, but once again it trails behind the Dimensity 900 and 920 at the top. And lastly, of course, testing our GPU within 3D Mark Wildlife, we got a score of 1,213 points and an average FPS of 7.3, which is a tad better than the Snapdragon 765G, quite a bit better, almost double that than its predecessor, the Snapdragon 690, but once again a tad behind the 2 Dimensity chips at the top. Nevertheless, it is still a phone at a great price, and it's done a great job when running these very demanding benchmarks. The Honor X30 looks fantastic thanks to looking identical to Huawei's Mate 40 series and premium Honor Magic 3 series devices with its glossy finish and circular camera module. Inside that module sits a more than decent 48 megapixel main shooter that takes acceptable photos in any lighting condition when compared to other devices at this price point, of course, but it unfortunately lacks an ultra-wide camera in favor of a depth sensor and macro camera. It has a very snappy fingerprint sensor on its side, which is situated in an easy to reach position, and once unlocked you are treated to Magic UI 5.0 skinned over Android 11, which is identical to Huawei's EMUI software skin. Magic UI is simple and easy to use with a few notable features, but I'm slightly disappointed not to see Android 12 here, as well as Google services, but I'm not too worried since the global launch will surely see both included. One of the major selling points of the X30 is Qualcomm's new mid-range chipset, the Snapdragon 695, and when paired with a 120Hz refresh rate makes for some smooth scrolling, but unfortunately many games don't seem to make use of the 120 frames per second feature in order to push the new chipset, but gaming is still a pleasure to do on the X30 thanks to stable frame rates and great thermals. The display itself is huge and packs in vibrant colors and decent brightness levels despite not being an AMOLED panel, and let's not forget about those near invisible bezels on the top and sides of the screen. Hopefully going forward, Honor can find a cost-effective way to minimize the chin size, because let's be honest, this is an extremely well-priced device, and not only does it have a huge battery with great efficiency and heat dissipation under high load, but is also one of the cheapest smartphones in the world to include 66-watt wired charging. The Honor X30 is a mid-range phone that knows it's a mid-range phone, and for that reason alone, I'm more than happy to recommend it to anyone on a tight budget, or to anyone looking for a great, all-round, and well-priced smartphone.